Hey, listeners of the Bio Report. Before we get started this week, I wanted to tell you about the digital library from Deep Dive. How much time does your team spend looking for research papers? Google, PubMed, social media. There's got to be a better way. You can now search a reference database of 100 million scientific papers and read the full text of 20 million articles, annotate them, and share with colleagues. It's the smarter way to do research. Here's the best part. If you're like me and been frustrated by not being able to access articles you find because they're behind a paywall, I've got good news. With Deep Dive, you get one-stop affordable research. If you're a listener of the Bio Report, you can try the enterprise version of the service for free for 1 month. Go to deepdive.com/podcast and enter the code BioReport. That's Deep Dive, DeepDive.com/podcast. And the code is BioReport, one word, all caps. I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. The biopharmaceutical industry has long struggled with R&D productivity. Longtime industry strategic consultant Mike Rea, founder and CEO of IDEA Pharma, thinks he's hit on a possible solution. Taking a cue from the tech industry, Rea in May announced the launch of Protodigm, which he describes as a contract skunkworks company. The approach is intended to allow a multi-disciplinary team work with autonomy to take its clients' early-stage assets and explore multiple development options at once with the intent of de-risking innovation while saving time and money. We spoke to Rea about the industry's challenge with R&D productivity, the benefits Protodym's skunkworks approach could provide, and how it will work with industry. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Danny.
We're going to talk about biopharmaceutical R&D productivity, challenges with that, and a new company you've launched called Protodigm to bring an approach that's been successful within the tech industry to address this challenge. Yeah. I think as long as I've been covering this industry, there have been concerns about declining R&D productivity. We've seen the emergence of new technologies that are supposed to improve that. We've certainly seen therapeutic modalities that should allow more efficient drug development. Where are we in terms of R&D productivity today, and how big a problem does it remain for the industry?
Well, I think it's the big problem, but I think you have to quantify that. And I think that there's been lots of reports that suggest that we've seen, year-on-year declines in the output of the pipelines for the amount of money spent. So, that's probably the only measure of productivity that matters, right? And I think, if you'll allow me a kind of, football, soccer analogy, I remember looking at the Brazil-Germany World Cup final a little while ago. And if you looked at the metrics, Brazil did pretty well. They outshot, they got more shots on target. They got more shots in general. They had more possession, but they failed to put the ball in the back of the net, and Germany managed to do it 7 times. And I think that's one of the issues that we have with the pharma industry, which is we're measuring stuff that doesn't matter. We're measuring attrition in phase 1. We're measuring failure rates in phase 2. But the thing that matters, getting the ball in the back of the net, is in decline, despite the increase in spend. So, you think those curves can't carry on the way that they're going on. So I'd say it's one of the big issues. But we need to be clear what we mean by productivity.
And not a bad analogy for an industry that likes to boast about shots on goal.
Exactly. Yeah. And say, but they are taking more shots. They're just not. What you would do if you're on the football field is that you would be questioning your technique. You'd be questioning your approach, and maybe questioning whether that's the right way to be doing it.
Listeners may know you as CEO of IDEA Pharma, a
Mm-hmm.
strategic consulting firm. You've spent a lot of time in that role exploring innovation within biopharmaceutical companies.
Yeah.
I suspect exploring decision-making in these organizations as well as dysfunction. As you think about the problems of R&D productivity, why do you think it's been such a persistent problem for this industry?
So I think there'd be a few contributors to that. And if people do know us, it's because of the Pharmaceutical Innovation Index, which, began 11 years ago with a simple question that we asked ourselves internally, which is, if you gave the same asset to two different companies, would they be equally successful? Would it end up in the same place? And most people knew the answer was no, but most people didn't know why. So we began to look for those analogs, and actually, it turns out there's a lot of that happening. A lot of people have the same drug at the same time, and therefore it's not the molecule that makes the difference. It's the people, it's the organizations, and this kind of creation of value from the pipeline. We went looking for why. Some companies are good at it and some companies are bad, and why some companies are better than others. I wouldn't say anyone's bad at it, but I think a lot of it, in our estimation, came down to the early stage decisions. I'd call it kind of risk mitigating behavior that the industry has adopted versus the opportunity seeking behavior that many in the tech world would recognize. And then you think, well, why is that? And actually, you look at the statistics. A lot of companies are defending old products, launched 10, 15, 20 years ago in some cases, which are still generating huge revenues. Well, if that's the kind of company that you want to be, then you behave that way. If your goal is to launch more products, then that's the way that you'll behave. But I think we've got a lot of people that have grown up in our industry who've learned the former, who've learned how to, launch big and then follow success that way, and have learned a lot less about how to optimize pipelines and portfolios.
People who know the tech industry may be familiar with the term skunkworks, but before we talk about Protodigm, can you explain what a skunkworks project is and how a skunkworks operation goes about its chores?
Yeah. I mean, tech's picked it up, but it began with the aerospace industry and McDonnell Douglas and others, where they would, in search of innovation, typically put a loosely structured bunch of, typically rebels in a different building outside of the kind of main culture and organization. And unsurprisingly, I think, because we all understand human behavior and psychology, that group would often tend to produce great stuff. And I think a lot of the great advances in in aerospace happened that way for a while. It's called skunkworks because it was downstream of a kind of sewage plant, the first building that they put them into, and it kind of picked up that name. But the tech industry, well-known, folks like Google X and Amazon has a version of it, which is often meant to, if the organization is getting in the way of, being agile, if it's getting in the way of doing new things, then it does make sense to have this kind of loosely structured group outside of that. So our version of it is, you need to have some of us looking at this stuff with that outside mindset, but also the ability to prototype, and learn by, learn by breaking things. And I think that's really where the kind of skunkworks mentality is potent for this industry.
How has your work at IDEA and your visibility into the industry led to the creation of Protodigm? What did you see as the opportunity you could address?
So the biggest thing, so IDEA, is a strategy, consultancy type practice, and we would often give, path to market ideas to our clients. So they give us an asset, we show them a range of destinations and a way to connect those things. But because the kind of the stuff that sits in the middle, the stuff that's pretty well illuminated already, has evidence behind it, people tend to pick the one that has evidence, and that feels logical. The problem is, I always use this metaphor of a kind of dark street with one street light lit. Everyone's comfortable under that light, and it's easy to make decisions lit by that one bulb. But when you all know that the rest of the street is there for people with torches to go exploring, we felt there's a lot of interesting ideas that are just being left for because we're risk mitigating, in that early stage. If we adopt an opportunity-seeking mindset, some of those ideas become possible. And the industry's got great examples of that, exactly that kind of behavior. So if you and your listeners know Cymbalta, Eli Lilly, that should have been an antidepressant. It was following Prozac to market, and the goal was to not cannibalize the antidepressant that had built the building in Indianapolis. So the opportunity to look at that drug in pain was an interesting one. A clue existed in the world that this drug and many drugs like it would have worked in pain. But the great thing about Lilly was that they saw that. They then did the studies in phase 2, which were, let's study pain where the patient is depressed, or let's study pain where the patient isn't depressed. If you do that in phase 2, then suddenly you get a great signal to pursue in phase 3, which is, yes, we work in pain where there's no depression. And then you've got an opportunity that came because of the behavior, not because of the drug, but because of what you chose to study. And that is, a wonderful kind of, talisman for the kind of work that we think should be done more often, which is opportunity-seeking, exploratory behavior in early stage that will lead to, things that you didn't expect. We often use this phrase of serendipity. Most of our great blockbusters, Avastin failed a lot of times before it even got anywhere close to a pipeline. Herceptin, was repurposed from a phase 2 failure. The statin class, failed a lot of times before it ever got close to a human. I think that learning by doing is opportunity-seeking behavior, and I don't think that our industry has done enough of that. I think that we've relied on what we would call the prediction paradigm of trying to predict, before it even goes into a human, exactly where it's going to end up. Everyone knows that you can't do that, but we behave as if we can.
You've said Protodigm is not a think tank. It's not an incubator, CRO, or a consulting firm. Instead, it's a contract skunkworks. What would a company retain Protodigm to do, and at what point in the discovery and development process would it ideally engage it?
So our sweet spot is probably phase 1, where that range of exploration is often beyond it's either beyond the capacity of the company or beyond the capability. So we've got a universe of solutions to from AI through translational work through novel metrics to throw at it, but also the variables that we like to look at are generating options is one thing. Also generating an evidential quality assessment is important. So what kinds of evidence are going to be useful for you to look at in the next stage, and putting for us to then put a range of different kinds of test in front of that asset is also important. So if you imagine a kind of agile, nimble CRO, which is really where we're focused, this kind of next generation CRO is into doing exploratory work, but also into looking at, well, what commercial model could suit this? What regulatory opportunity might exist? If you think about, say, a product that combines a molecule, novel formulation, in a novel device with a biomarker and a digital solution, most companies can't build that internally today. That's the kind of thing that we can build. We don't have to get it right the first time. We can learn by doing, and actually the learning by doing is the key differentiator for what we're doing.
Well, what's the range of expertise that Protodigm is able to call on, and what's the process? Does it approach every project in the same way? Is there a different process depending on the asset?
Yeah, no, that's insightful. We have to approach every asset with a view to optimizing it, and the kind of things that we call upon. So, we have an AI engine which generates hypotheses. Of course, that's only interesting in that it's a hypothesis, it's a clue. But then, we've got access to an awful lot of different technologies for, studying and generating proofs of concept and proofs of principle there. When it comes to what a clinical study would look like, of course, there's also AI and machine learning solutions there. But internally, we've got decision scientists. So we look at what we call the kind of geometry of decision making, which is, in order to go from here to where you want to get to, what kind of vantage points are useful on your opportunity. So if we're going to do this kind of opportunity seeking behavior, the key thing is to lay out with the client a list of things that we would like to know. So we generate this plan to learn, and then we go find out some stuff, and then we come back and look at what we just found out, and then we make a decision about what else to pursue. So it's a kind of staged, sequential process, if you like, where typically we'll go, through multiple parallel steps in the first place. But the key is to say, well, what kind of evidence is useful to know at this stage, or could we accelerate? So if you think about being a kind of client of ours, at the end of, say, 6 months or a year, you'll have a range of validated options to pursue, which you couldn't get by pursuing this kind of linear path that the industry's pursued so far.
Well, expand on that. What's different about what Protodigm is doing compared to what a company does within its own walls?
So I'll give you an anecdote. A few years ago, I was talking with someone in a pharma company who had a TRPV1 receptor antagonist, which is essentially heat pain drug. And when I asked where it was, they said, "Oh, it's in proof of concept at the moment." So I said, "Well, okay, tell me more." And said, "Well, it's in an osteoarthritis proof of concept." And I'm not the world's best scientist, but I said, "Well, are there any of those receptors in the joints?" And he said, "Well, no." So I said, "Well, how will it work in osteoarthritis?" He said, "Well, it won't." And so then the question was, well, why is it where it is? And they said, well, actually, the regulator said if we wanted a pain indication, we had to do an osteoarthritis proof of concept. Now, you or I would look at the logic of that and say, that's nuts, right? Because that's not a proof of concept for this drug. This drug needed you to look at, different opportunities for a heat pain drug. And, it might be burn pain, it might be, who knows what. But it has a specific set of opportunities that you would like to gather evidence for. And the linear process that companies have pursued, which is we would like this to be an osteoarthritis drug or a pain drug, which therefore, you lay out the studies and everyone does the same study. And that's why you get attrition. That's why you have these declining productivity rates, because people, want to have an Alzheimer's drug and everything that they pick up is either a yes or a no for that profile. If you flip it and you look at what the drug might be, if you were to give it, its opportunity, you behave differently. Suddenly you don't know where it's going to land, but you're interested in the journey. So that, I think that's really very different. It's 180 degrees from the way the industry has behaved so far.
There are many companies that explore multiple indications for experimental therapies. What's different about the way Protodigm is going about this?
It's unusual in major pharma to do that. I think that the exploration of multiple indications is often, I'm going to say, sequential. It's rarely done in parallel, and it's often done once the drug has, survived phase 1, phase 2. I think it's unusual to be doing it at preclinical and phase 1 to set out with a kind of bunch of competing paths, and to then weigh them up against each other, or to see what you learn by, heading down any particular path. So, those companies that are doing it, great, we would encourage it, because I think that opportunity-seeking behavior is to be encouraged. But even within the indication, if you take, let's say, rheumatoid arthritis, there's still an unmet need, there's still, symptoms, there is pathology, there is progression, there's damage, there's all kinds of opportunity within the indication. So I think that getting a kind of line of sight, a vantage point on the opportunity, that this drug will have in those spaces, I think does need a, this kind of planned serendipity of, doing enough exploration to find out where its true talent might lie.
I think a lot of people have long talked about making pharma more tech-like, but there are some differences between these industries that make this challenging. This is a highly regulated industry, one where there are life cycle of moving from idea to product is measured in years rather than months. I think about synthetic biology, which operates like an engineering discipline, offering some analogy to that extent. But to what extent do you think therapeutics can go through a rigorous and staged set of experiments and tests and be developed in this way?
Yeah, I think the challenge of how analogous we are to tech, I think it depends, right? If you're developing an app for an app store and it's a version of Candy Crush, that's one thing. But if you're developing self-driving cars, that's quite another. And you think about the way that, say, Google's gone about that, or about, Google Maps and the way that they started. Some of the problems were, there's clearly regulatory issues there. There's safety issues. There's all kinds of, commercial issues. But people at Google would say you've got to start by starting, and and also perhaps have diversity of an approach. So let's not assume that we know the way how to do this. And sometimes you have to build the tools to get it done as you're going. And so I think that there are tech metaphors. I would say the nuclear power industry would be another one that is even more highly regulated than pharma, where some of these approaches are important, because I think this is where innovation comes from. I think that for those companies that are prepared to bet on either the world is uncertain or the world is certain, and so far pharma mostly predicts as if they're able to predict with some degree of accuracy where a drug will work, and with some degree of accuracy that if it works, they're going to get $1 billion per year for it. We don't believe that you can do either of those things in early phase. We think that you have to set up the kind of experiments to find out where the talent lies for the drug, and where the market might sit, and also, as we've just seen with Biogen, we've seen lots of companies take almost exactly the same drug through development, and only one so far has had an approval. We see this time and time again, and I think this desire to be different, to differentiate, will have to come back to maximizing the intrinsic value. And it's probably a good example would be Pixar versus Disney. Pixar was successful with every movie that it launched, and at the time Disney was getting about 1 in 10 as to be successful. So it was, and this flagship has said recently they want to launch 100 drugs in 10 years. Well, even if you added up the top 30, you wouldn't get that number of drugs. So we believe that you have to behave differently rather than just to incrementally improve some of the steps in the process.
There have been a number of efforts over the years to address R&D productivity in the industry at various times. I want to ask you about two of those. The first is GlaxoSmithKline, which sought to make big pharma more biotech-like by breaking up R&D into small, highly focused teams that operated with greater autonomy and competed for funding. Any thoughts on how that panned out?
Yeah, I actually just finished an interview with Dan Skavronsky at Lilly, who, Lilly came top of our index this year, the innovation index. And I didn't realize that they'd also done what you just described at GSK, which is, you bring in Loxo oncology, and instead of making them work your way around, you give them your oncology assets. And I think there's some value in that. And I think if you think about why that's true, if you are, let's say, an antivirals company and you've made some huge steps forward in an area like hepatitis C, and then you decide that you want to be an oncology company, well, I think the thing that you might forget is that the people at the top who are making decisions are good at antivirals. They're not necessarily good at understanding oncology. So you either feed them basic information with which to make a decision, or which is tends to be what happens, and therefore you end up with really bad decisions. Or you say, well, why don't we have some people that understand oncology deeply making the decisions? And the kind of tacit information that's brought to decisions is so important for our industry. You look at the kind of golden periods that companies have had, and the people who are running them deeply understood their therapeutic areas. So I think it's a really interesting hypothesis that an organization would build itself around, structural, functional units. Getting that right is not guaranteed. I don't think GSK have done that yet, but I think with someone like Lilly, you've seen the success of that model.
The other is a more recent approach, although I think there's a lot of similarity. That this is one that's been advocated by MIT finance theorist Andrew Lo, who argues for a portfolio approach to drug development. And this has been embodied by companies like Bridge Bio, which he co-founded. How do you see that model addressing R&D productivity?
Well, it really depends on your portfolio hypothesis. I think that if your portfolio hypothesis reduces the dependency on any one asset to be successful, then you're essentially hoping that one of the portfolio will pay for the rest of the portfolio. So it's certainly a valid hypothesis, and there's a lot that can be learned from decision making theory as it applies to, even things like gambling and other, methods of making decisions, or chess. No one sets out in a game of chess trying to predict the end game. You take steps forward. I think the portfolio approach is one that we've tried a lot, and I think that the problem is that we're not working with great numbers. So portfolio theory works best when you can predict with some degree of accuracy what the outcome is going to be. In our industry, you've got no idea, because as you know, you've got biology and you've got all kinds of factors that you can't predict. And even if you could predict all of that, we're also very bad at predicting market performance. So, I think that if you need a kind of arithmetic, mathematical model to, profile your opportunities, you're going to have to put good numbers in. And I think we don't have good numbers to put in at the moment. And we often fool ourselves with, probabilities of success, probabilities of technical success, regulatory success, and so forth. They always come out higher than they should because people want to keep their programs going. And as soon as we look at the real numbers, it gets really hard to do the kind of portfolio work that you describe.
And how have companies you've spoken to about Protodigm reacted to the idea of using the skunkworks approach?
It's been phenomenal. Yeah, we were lucky enough to have a couple of roundtables from some heads of R&D before we officially launched, and I guess in the spirit of the company, one of the great things was that they pointed us at things that we didn't expect that they might want us to do. So, things that we did expect were where there's capacity issues. Focus is often on one or two assets, and they just don't have time to do the exploration that they know is valuable. Let's say you've got a product, you've got a lead indication, you're studying it, and your heads are down doing that. That the life cycle is going to be important. That in a year or two's time, you're going to be making those decisions. But who's doing that early phase work on that asset? Many companies just have capacity bandwidth issues there. So we knew that. We also knew that the kind of this kind of combinatology world of building devices with digital solutions and biomarkers was something that most companies are too siloed to do. We knew that. And then they gave us a bunch of other things that they said, well, it would be great if you could work in the business development process, if you could help us with some asymmetry in the conversation. Optionality, the plan to learn, is critical for when we're looking at something, could help us differentiate. Things like pre-competitive opportunities that they would have us do as well. So, I think that's the spirit, is that you can't know until you start. There's been a huge appetite in for what we do, and there was a great question asked at one of those advisory meetings, which is, when we asked someone, well, you've got 10,000 people, why would you give something like this to us? His response was, have you ever asked 10,000 people to do anything? I thought it was such an interesting insight to how hard it is to get big companies to do something small. Or agile, that was a great opportunity for us to dive into there.
Given the time and cost of developing drugs, it's, I think, hard to characterize this industry as risk averse. You make a distinction between good risk and bad risk. How can a company recognize that difference and increase good risk while decreasing bad risk?
Yeah, so I mean, we often talk about quality of risk in a decision, and I think that our framework, option quality, evidential quality, and decision quality is often areas where risk is hidden. I think, as I've talked about, how wrong most of our numbers are in early stage. So the EMPV is typically inflated and done by people that aren't good at predicting, and they don't get good at predicting because they don't have to go back and check their own numbers. So there's technical risk that gets hidden just because we don't ask hard enough questions. There's regulatory risk because we're not looking for real answers from regulators about what we might do. But I think the big kind of shadow on the wall is commercial risk. So we see companies launching drugs that no one seems to want all the time, and I think the figure that we have is there's only 1 in 4 drugs that launch that makes back its own R&D investment. Never mind pays for the other failures. So that's a hidden risk. But I think we prefer to look at this as, instead of identifying risk and mitigating it, is what are the behaviors that tend to lead to opportunity seeking. And I think if you try and minimize risk, companies tend to talk about phase 1 and phase 2 failures as risky. But of course, that's not what phase 1 and phase 2 are for. We shouldn't be talking about failure of phase 1, phase 2, because those are exploratory, experimental phases. So I think the quality of risk does matter, how you take it, when you take it. I think we've seen risk pushed into phase 3 by many companies because they haven't done enough in phase 1, phase 2. Just for example, 50% of studies in phase 3 fail for inability to recruit or accrue patients for the studies. So there's all kinds of operational and other risks that's just being pushed. Someone said kick the whale down the beach, because the kind of incentives often are to throw an asset from phase 1 into 2 or from 2 into 3, and those toll gates, I think, they're not always looking for the real picture. They're often looking for just a small enough signal to proceed.
Mike Rea, CEO and founder of IDEA Pharma and founder of Protodigm. Mike, thanks so much for your time today.
Danny, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.